Over the course of this video, I'm going to discuss using primary as well as secondary research. In addition, I'll go over some scenarios in terms of which method would be appropriate. Obviously, like most things, one particular method of research isn't necessarily appropriate in all situations, and also provide some examples of some of the different research methods that would fall underneath the umbrella of both primary as well as secondary research. Now, typically before we get to the point to where we're going to be conducting some type of research, usually we start with some type of problem. And we have to be presented with some type of issue first and have a clear depiction of what that problem is before we can get to the stage in which we're conducting research. Because typically in a business setting, research is conducted for the sake of answering some type of question or solving some type of problem. And the research phase is what allows us to accomplish that and to solve that issue or to answer that particular question. Now, there are two different types of research. The first of which, as I mentioned before, is known as primary research. Primary research is research that you actually go out and conduct on your own. This is best served when your particular issue is not necessarily presented already. It isn't something that is widely researched. And so if you have a specific problem, you may not be able to find existing sources of information to answer your particular question. It may be so specific, maybe you can find more general information, demographic information, but it'd be very difficult to find specifically the types of issues that are affecting your particular group. So, for example, maybe you're conducting some type of research study to assess the effect of television viewing habits within a specific demographic. Now, maybe there are certain statistics available for television use with regards to general populations and even geographic information. But what if you're looking for a specific show that's on during a specific time and you're trying to whittle it down to a specific audience? It'd be very difficult to do. And the more specific that you get, the less likely you are to find some existing research that's already done. Under those circumstances, it would be appropriate to go through what we call primary research. And that means you're actually going to be conducting the research on your own. Existing research is not available specifically for your issue, and so your job is going to be developing an instrument to obtain the information that you need, gather the data, analyze it, and evaluate what that says, and obviously answer your particular question or hope to solve your problem, whatever that might be. Now, primary research typically is not done initially. And the reason for that is it can be very expensive, not only from a monetary standpoint, but also from a time standpoint. And so usually what most people do first is they do some secondary research. It's very more common. Before I go on to the different primary research methods, I do want to go into secondary research. And the reason that you want to do this initially is because secondary research is information that is already made available to you. You simply have to find it. And so the research has already been done, the information is already presented. Maybe it's not necessarily quite geared towards your particular problem or issue, but you can still use the information. And so typically in a research setting, usually we start with the secondary research because it is relatively easy to attain, and we're not going to go through an extreme process in trying to create different surveys and various instruments for the purpose of gathering information. So if you were to utilize a secondary research method, if you were doing research for some type of report or anything similar to that, what would you do? Some common secondary research methods. There are printed sources, and then obviously with technology we have a wealth of electronic sources as well. Printed sources include books, either textbooks or just other, kind of nonfiction type books, periodicals, newspapers, things like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, as well as government documents as well. And those provide a wealth of information. Once again, maybe not geared specifically towards the issue that you're researching, But once again, you can gather information and at least apply it possibly to your particular situation. Another great thing that secondary research allows you to do is frame your problem even further. Maybe you start off by thinking your problem is one thing, and after conducting a little bit of secondary research, you gather a little more information. Maybe you start to fine-tune what your problem is. You start to get a better depiction over what the true issue is that you're being presented with. Now, electronic sources are obviously in great supply as well, and those include generally academic databases. Most colleges and four-year universities usually provide academic databases for their students and for those enrolled for the sake of gathering information. Things like EBSCOhost and LexisNexis and ProQuest are all databases geared towards specific subjects. And so you will want to make sure, and depending upon what you're researching, a certain database will be more conducive to that. So you will want to research generally where the database pulls the information from. But they provide a wealth of information, usually different periodicals that are kind of consolidated from the internet. And the great thing that it does is it builds credible sources. So you don't necessarily have to worry about if the information is reliable. The database ensures the information they have is credible and reliable information, which is very, very good. So that's a great place to start. If you have access to those databases with your particular institution, that would be a great place to look. Obviously, you can do what many of us do, and that's go through a search engine like Google or Yahoo or Bing and try to look for or search for our particular issue here. The problem that you get into is obviously trusting the source. You're going to pull information from a wide variety of sources. It can be credible, it cannot be credible, it can be blogs, which really are more of someone's opinion potentially. And so you do want to be careful with that, because if you're doing any type of objective analysis where you're drawing conclusions and you're making recommendations to anyone, if you're making your recommendation off of inaccurate information, obviously your recommendation is not going to be accurate, and that's going to reflect poorly on you. So you do want to make sure that you do your due diligence and you check your sources to make sure that they're certainly credible. Now, in the event that you go through the process of conducting your secondary research and you discover that, I can't adequately answer my question here, there isn't research available based upon my particular problem because it's so specific that the chances of somebody doing this maybe in my specific geographic area, wherever you're located, then maybe you have to do the research your own. And then you would go to primary research, which, as I said before, is more expensive, it is more taxing on your time, but you're going to get more valid information. You're going to get information that is geared specifically towards your problem versus maybe information that was gathered for another purpose and you're trying to use it for your purposes, of course. And there may be a problem with that. So let's say you have to conduct some primary research. There's a number of different options available to you. I will go over kind of a few of them just so you get kind of an idea on what this looks like. You have first mailed surveys. So in this particular type of secondary or primary research, you would actually create a survey, obtain a database of some sort where you have access to people's home addresses, or you can purchase these from various places as well. And you would essentially send out your particular survey en masse to a number of addresses and kind of cross your fingers and just hope and pray that people actually fill them out and send them back. And that is a great way to reach a wide variety of people. Very good if you're trying to pull geographically certain zip codes or certain areas. The problem, though, although they're relatively inexpensive, obviously if you're sending them out in mass, you have to pay for postage and then printing and all those different things. But if you're dividing that by the number of people you reach, then it is relatively inexpensive. But they have very, very low response rates. And if you think about when you get something in the mail that you don't recognize the sender, do you really open it? Do you even look at it? If you do, how long is it before you actually toss it in the trash? If you're like me, you're literally looking at some of your mail near a trash can, and as your hand is dropping down into the trash can, you're kind of looking through it just to see if there's anything important, and then boom, you drop it in the trash can, you never see it again. So it's very difficult to get a very high response rate with these types of mailed surveys because it's not necessarily a hot lead, as we say. It's not someone that necessarily is probably interested in the actual survey. So chances are they're not going to take the time to do that. They also have low response rates because people's time are valuable. And unless you offer them some type of incentive or reason to participate, right? We all think about it, what's in it for me? Then you're not likely to get very good responses. The difficult thing too is you don't really know who is actually completing that survey. And so it's really difficult when you talk about inferential statistics and being able to infer certain things based upon how people respond. It's very difficult to do that when you don't know who it is that's responding. And so there may be some disconnect there. The person that's responding may not be part of the kind of target market that you're trying to get their opinion for. It might be somebody else. Also with surveys, it's very difficult to obtain detailed information. And the reason for that is the surveys can't be very complex, because if they're complex, people aren't going to respond to them. And so they have to be very basic. The questions are very short, very direct, not requiring a whole lot of thought process, because if people have to think in great detail about them, they're likely not to respond. The next thing you can do are telephone surveys. And telephone surveys attempt to kind of counteract some of the disadvantages of mailed surveys, mainly with the allowing for clarification. Because if someone is confused, if you have more of a complex survey you're trying to administer, it generally helps to have someone on the phone who can explain maybe how to complete the survey if you're actually mailing them a survey, or if they're taking it over the phone, obviously explain what it is that they're looking for and all those different things. It is a little more expensive than mailed surveys because you do have somebody's time, obviously, to collect all the information, and so they're calling people individually. This also has a very low response rate, and the reason for that is a lot of people don't necessarily even have home phones now. We often just utilize our cell phones for both. And so in that case, you're going to have a very difficult time targeting certain people, especially geographically. But another thing on top of that is with caller ID and that type of technology available, usually if we don't recognize the number, we're less inclined to pick up the phone to begin with. And so it's very difficult to get someone on the line. With the age of telemarketing and the do not call and opt-out lists, this has become increasingly unpopular, people being bothered at home. And so you're seeing a lot of people kind of go away from this method of research simply because from a societal standpoint, it isn't very popular and it's relatively or very unsuccessful, I might add. The next thing you can do are personal interviews. This can be either in a one-on-one setting, or you can do what we call a focus group, in which you have a group of people in a room and you're asking them all similar questions or the same question and eliciting responses from them. So those are various things you can do. You can get more detailed information here, which is great. You can seek clarification because you have someone that's actually asking the questions and can actually answer questions from the opposing person. But you have a small reach here, because if you're doing an interview one-on-one, the interviewer can only reach one person at a time. And so you're paying for that person's time and they're only interacting with one person. So it gets very, very expensive. The reach is very small. It is very time consuming. But another issue here is that when we start to introduce people into the equation and asking questions, we have the potential for a lot of errors to occur. I'm not going to go over specifically all the different rater biases and things that get introduced, but there are a lot of errors that interviewers can make that can throw off the results, so they're not necessarily reliable. They're not what you would hope to obtain. The last thing we can do is email polling, and we've seen an insurgence of email polling strictly because technology has allowed for it. It allows to get quick responses. Facebook now has a polling function in which you can poll certain people and ask them questions. SurveyMonkey is a very popular site in which you can register for a free account and create a survey of 10 questions and have that emailed out to a certain number of people or sent links out, and you can get responses immediately. It has a statistics function as well, so it tabulates responses and percentages so you know exactly how people responded on various questions. Very easy to use. You can pay a little extra and obviously increase the number of questions. And so I've used it myself before, and it's great for gathering just a little bit of information, basic questions. But once again, you have a wide reach of people, which is very helpful, relatively inexpensive. The problem, though, is that once again, you get low response rates. And the reason is that people are completely inundated with just emails and junk mail and different things. And, once again, a lot of times when I go through my inbox, I'm looking at who the subject or who it's from. And if I don't necessarily recognize the sender, I don't even bother reading it. So chances are, if you're using email polling as a way of gathering information, unless you have some way of distinguishing yourself and building credibility with the viewer, you're going to have a very, very low response rate. And similar to mailed surveys, you're going to have to sell the benefit for the user. Why would they benefit participating in the survey? Do they receive something? Is it in their best interest to? Because ultimately, if we don't feel like it's in our best interest, it's not worth our time, we're not going to follow through with it. But it is still widely used, but there's different tricks that we can do to make it so that it's more effective. Now, hopefully, if you're doing any type of research, you keep these different tools in mind. And as I said before, there isn't one situation or one scenario that's conducive to all situations. Ideally, maybe we'd like to do personal interviews all the time, right? Maybe they're more effective because we're interacting directly with the person, but you have to also deal with feasibility. And is it feasible for you to pay someone or you yourself actually conduct the interview? Maybe you don't have the time. Maybe you don't have the skill set, right? Interviewers specifically related to market research are trained very heavily, I might add, to ask questions a certain way so they're not necessarily swaying the responses one way or another, because you want to get accurate information for better or for worse. So keep these things in mind here. Most likely you'll be looking at secondary research for the most part and gathering information, in which I caution you to look at the credibility of the information you're gathering, look at the credibility of the person providing it, and do go through those academic databases if you have access to them, because they can provide a wealth of information, but also make sure that the information is from a reliable source.